My name is Austin Dillon. At 35, I've built a chain of auto repair shops spanning across America, something no one in my family ever thought I could achieve. Now I'm driving back to Nashville, to the mansion where I grew up, to attend Thanksgiving dinner, the first time in nearly a decade. My heart is a tangled mess of emotions, anxiety, anticipation, and a familiar pang of pain. I never expected that. During that dinner, my father would make an announcement that silenced the entire room. He declared that I would receive not a single cent of the family inheritance. I just smiled, bowed my head, and continued eating my meal. No one knew that moment was only the beginning of a truth that would force my entire family to see me in a completely different light. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, in the sprawling Dillon family mansion, where the wealth and prestige of Dillon Furniture Co. permeated every corner. My father, Albert Dillon, was a stern man, always placing sky-high expectations on the shoulders of his three sons. My mother, Caroline, was gentler, but her gaze toward me always carried a hint of indifference, as if I were a misplaced piece in the perfect puzzle of our family. My eldest brother, Henry, with his sharp intellect and leadership skills, was my father's pride and joy. My second brother, Scott, with his charming smile and business acumen, was no less impressive. And then there was me, Austin, the youngest, always seen as the spare brother, the one who could never live up to anyone's expectations. The Dillon household never lacked money, but it lacked the one thing I craved most: love. My childhood was a string of long, lonely days, feeling out of place in my own home. I remember weekend mornings when Henry and Scott were taken by my father to the company, eagerly listening as he talked about business strategies or how to select the finest wood for luxurious dining tables. My mother would take them shopping at the mall, picking out expensive suits or polished shoes. I was allowed to tag along, but I always felt like a shadow, silently trailing behind, unnoticed. My questions were often ignored, my stories unheard. Once I excitedly shared about a kite I had made myself, but my mother only gave a faint smile before turning to praise Scott for his stellar school presentation. I gradually learned to stay quiet, to keep my thoughts to myself. Holidays like Christmas or Thanksgiving were when I felt this distance most acutely. The family gathered around the dining table, the chandelier's light glimmering over lavish dishes, but I always felt like an uninvited guest. My father talked about the company's future. My mother shared plans for upcoming trips, and Henry and Scott competed to boast about their achievements. I sat there, picking at a piece of turkey, listening to stories I had no part in. Once I tried to join in, sharing about an adventure book I'd just read, but my father only gave a cursory nod before turning to ask Henry about market expansion plans. I smiled, but inside I felt a cold void. And so I grew up feeling like an ellipsis in the perfect narrative of the Dillon family. I didn't blame my parents or brothers. Perhaps they didn't mean to overlook me. I just wasn't exceptional or dazzling enough to capture their attention. But that loneliness, like a small thorn, pricked my heart every day, leaving scars I could never forget. There was only one place in the world where I truly felt I belonged: my grandparents' small house in the outskirts of Nashville. Every summer, every holiday, I'd beg my parents to let me go there. My father would frown, my mother would sigh, but they always agreed, perhaps thinking I'd be less of a bother there. And for me, just hearing my grandfather Victor call out, "Austin, come here," was enough to warm my heart. My grandparents' house wasn't grand or glamorous like our mansion. It was an old wooden home with a backyard full of wild grass and a small shed packed with tools. But that was where I found true love. My grandmother Dorothy always greeted me with a tight hug, the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. She'd sit and tell stories about her youth, about how she and my grandfather met at a town dance. Those stories, no matter how many times I heard them, always made me giggle like it was the first time. My grandfather, he was my hero. A former auto engineer, he'd spent his life tinkering with machines. In his shed, I learned how to disassemble and reassemble engines, how to listen to a machine's hum to understand what it was saying. He didn't just teach me technical skills. He instilled in me a passion. "Every car has a story, Austin," he'd say, wrench in hand, eyes sparkling. "You just have to listen and you'll figure out how to make it run smoothly." At my grandparents' house, I could be myself. I didn't need to be as brilliant as Henry or as charming as Scott. I just needed to be Austin, the boy who loved getting his hands dirty with engine oil and listening to my grandfather's tales of vintage cars. There I was loved, noticed, seen. Every time I left that house to return to Nashville, I carried a bit of warmth with me, like a small flame burning in my chest, helping me endure the lonely days at home. But even my grandparents couldn't fully erase the sense of being out of place. Some nights, lying in bed, I wondered if I truly belonged to this family. Henry and Scott were born to carry on my father's legacy, to lead Dillon Furniture Company. But me? I didn't know what I was born for. I loved cars, the feeling of fixing something and making it run again. But whenever I mentioned that passion, I got puzzled looks from my parents, as if I were speaking a foreign language. When I was 15, a small but pivotal moment left a lasting mark on me. It was a Thanksgiving evening with the family gathered around the dining table. My father was discussing plans for a new factory. Henry chimed in with a bold idea for smart furniture, and Scott eagerly shared about a business seminar he'd attended. I sat there, quietly eating, then suddenly spoke up. "I fixed a car engine at Grandpa's today. The valve was stuck, but I figured out how to get it running again." I thought my father might be curious, my mother might smile, or at least someone would ask more. But no. My father gave a slight nod. My mother glanced at me for a second before praising Henry's idea. Scott even laughed, joking, "Fixing cars? Watch out, you'll get your shirt all dirty, Austin." That comment, though meant as a joke, cut like a knife. I lowered my head, my face burning, not from embarrassment, but from anger. Anger that no one cared, that no one saw what I did as valuable. From that moment, I knew I needed to find another place, another path, where I could be myself without having to prove anything to anyone. My childhood passed like that, in loneliness interspersed with rare moments of warmth at my grandparents' house. I didn't know that those days were quietly shaping me, preparing me for a journey I never imagined I could take. But that's a story for later. For now, when I was 18, a decision changed everything. That decision not only infuriated my parents and made my brothers mock me, but it also pushed me out of the Dillon family's world. I still vividly remember that fateful day. It was a chilly autumn evening in Nashville, the lights in the Dillon mansion's dining room blazing, reflecting off the oak-paneled walls my father took such pride in. The family was gathered around the table, not for dinner, but to hear Henry and Scott talk about their plans for the future. Henry, fresh out of Harvard, had started working at Dillon Furniture Co., confidently presenting a new line of smart furniture he wanted to develop. Scott, in his third year at Stanford, excitedly shared stories of the business seminars he'd attended, where professors praised his sharp thinking. My father, Albert Dillon, sat at the head of the table, nodding approvingly, his eyes brimming with pride. My mother, Caroline, smiled gently, occasionally chiming in with words of praise. And me, as usual, I sat quietly in the corner listening, unsure whether I should even speak. But that night I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. Deep inside me, a fire had been smoldering for years, kindled by my grandfather Victor during those summer days in his shed, filled with the scent of engine oil. I had thought long and hard, and I knew what I wanted. I didn't want to be part of Dillon Furniture Co. Didn't want to live to meet my parents' expectations. I wanted to pursue my passion, fixing cars, working with machines, listening to their stories, just as my grandfather had taught me. And to do that, I didn't need a prestigious college degree. I wanted to learn a trade, to feel the weight of a wrench in my hand, to sense the pulse of an engine. As dinner neared its end, I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "Dad, Mom," I said, my voice trembling but resolute, "I've made a decision. I'm not going to college. I want to learn auto repair." The room fell silent. I felt every pair of eyes turn to me, sharp as daggers. My father stopped chewing, his brows furrowing tightly, his face reddening as if he were about to explode. My mother's mouth fell open, her eyes wide with shock as if I'd just said something unthinkable. Henry and Scott glanced at me, then at each other, smirks slowly creeping across their faces. "Auto repair?" my father roared, his voice thundering through the room. "What did you just say, Austin? You think this is a joke?" He slammed his hand on the table, making the wine glasses rattle. I saw my mother flinch, her hand clutching her napkin, her eyes pleading with me to take back my words. "I'm not joking," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I've thought about it carefully. I want to work with cars. I want to learn the trade, become a mechanic. It's what I love." "A mechanic?" my father nearly shouted, his face contorted with rage. "You're a Dillon, Austin. You think this family built an empire so you could go do some low-life job? You want to be a laughingstock?" My heart tightened, but I didn't back down. "I don't think it's low-life," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It's my passion. Grandpa taught me." "Don't drag your grandfather into this," my father interrupted, his eyes cutting like knives. "Your grandfather was an engineer, not some roadside grease monkey. What are you doing with your life, Austin? Throwing away everything this family has built?" My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling as if she were holding back tears. "Austin, you're still young. You don't understand. College will open so many doors for you. Henry and Scott both—" "I'm not Henry or Scott," I burst out, unable to hold back any longer. "I don't want to do what they do. I want to do what I love, what makes me feel like it matters." I knew I was shouting, but I couldn't stop. Each word was like a knife slicing through the years of being overlooked, ignored. Henry, sitting across from me, let out a mocking laugh. "Come on, Austin, stop dreaming. Fixing cars? You think you'll make a living doing that? Or are you planning to mooch off Mom and Dad forever?" Scott chuckled, shaking his head as if I were an idiot. Their words poured fuel on the fire. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to jump up. "I'll manage on my own," I said, looking straight into my father's eyes. "I don't need anyone's help." My father shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Fine," he growled. "If you choose that path, don't expect a single cent from me. No tuition, no house, nothing. And don't you dare carry the Dillon name. You'll disgrace this family." His words hit me like a hammer to the chest. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My mother lowered her head, saying nothing. Henry and Scott looked at me with a mix of smugness and contempt. I stood up, my legs trembling, but I forced myself to keep my back straight. "I understand," I said, my voice cold despite the shattering pain in my heart. "I'll leave." I walked out of the dining room, not looking back. I heard my mother call my name, but I didn't stop. I went to my room, packed a few clothes, some saved-up money, and the notebook my grandfather had given me, filled with the car repair tips he'd taught me. I knew I couldn't stay in that house for another minute. That night, I drove my grandfather's old pickup truck to the outskirts of town, where my grandparents were waiting. When I walked in, my grandmother Dorothy enveloped me in a tight hug, saying nothing, just stroking my hair like she did when I was a child. My grandfather Victor sat in his armchair, looking at me with a gaze both stern and kind. "What did you say to your parents?" he asked. I recounted everything, my voice choking. When I got to the part where my father cut off all support, my grandfather only nodded, unsurprised. "Austin," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "follow your own path. Don't let others define your worth. If fixing cars is what you love, then do it better than anyone else. You'll find your place, I'm certain of it." His words were like a flame warming my frozen heart. That night, lying on the small guest bed in my grandparents' house, I felt both pain and freedom. Pain from my family's rejection, but freedom because, for the first time, I had stood up for myself. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. I would prove I wasn't the spare brother. I would prove that Austin Dillon had worth even if it wasn't the Dillon name my father wanted me to carry. But reality was harsher than I'd imagined. When I left my grandparents' house carrying a few clothes and my grandfather's notebook, I had nothing but determination and a small amount of savings. My father kept his word, not a single cent of support. My bank account, which my parents had funded for my expenses, was locked. My phone no longer received messages from my mother, and the rare calls from Henry or Scott, already few and far between, stopped entirely. I was erased from the Dillon family's world as if I had never been part of it. I moved to a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Nashville, renting a tiny room where the smell of mildew and the sound of car horns filled the night. The room had just enough space for a single bed, an old wooden table, and a flickering desk lamp. But I didn't complain. For the first time, I was living for myself, and despite the hardships, I felt a strange sense of freedom, as if I were breathing with my own lungs. To afford tuition for auto repair school, I took any job I could find. I washed dishes at a small diner, my feet aching after 8-hour shifts, the smell of grease clinging to my clothes. I worked as a waiter at a cafe, learning to smile at difficult customers even when I wanted to scream. Some days I hauled goods at the market, my shoulders sore from carrying heavy crates. I even delivered packages in my grandfather's old pickup truck, driving across the city under scorching sun or pouring rain. Every dollar I earned was soaked in sweat, but I cherished it. It wasn't my father's money, not the Dillon family's money. It was mine. From a pampered rich kid raised in luxury, I now tasted the life of an ordinary worker. Some nights, sitting in my cramped room staring at my calloused, oil-stained hands, I wondered if I was on the right path. My father's mocking words, Henry and Scott's scornful laughter still echoed in my mind. A mechanic? You think you'll make a living doing that? But every time doubt crept in, I opened my grandfather's notebook, reading the words he'd written. Listen to the machine, Austin. It will show you the way. And I'd get back up, wipe the sweat from my brow, and keep going. The trade school was nothing like the prestigious universities Henry and Scott attended. It was an old building with classrooms filled with the smell of oil and the clatter of metal. But there I found joy. I learned how to dissect engines, diagnose strange noises, and replace tiny bolts. Every time a car came back to life under my hands, my heart raced as if I'd just solved a complex puzzle. The instructors noticed my dedication. They said I had golden hands and a sharp mind, but I just smiled, thinking I was only doing what I loved. After 2 years, I graduated from trade school with a certificate in auto repair. There was no grand commencement ceremony like the ones Henry and Scott had, no proud parents clapping, no family photos. Just me, a piece of paper, and a burning dream. I found a job at a small garage on the outskirts of Nashville, run by Joe, a veteran mechanic. Joe's garage wasn't anything special, a dusty lot with a few old cars lined up and a faded sign that read Joe's Auto Repair. But to me, it was where I began. The work at the garage was far from easy. I worked from early morning to late at night, dismantling engines, changing oil, fixing tires, sometimes lying under cars for hours in stifling heat. Sweat mixed with engine oil streaking my face. But I didn't mind. Every car was a challenge, every repair a small victory. I began to understand the value of hard work, of standing on my own 2 feet. I was no longer the spoiled Dillon kid, no longer the forgotten son. I was Austin, a mechanic, and I was proud of it. Joe, with his silver hair and keen eyes, quickly took notice of me. He said I had potential not just in my hands, but in my head. I didn't just fix cars. I thought about how to do things better. I suggested ways to reorganize the garage to streamline work, ways to track orders to avoid missing customers. I even taught myself some basics of online marketing, proposing that Joe create a simple website for the garage and post about our services on local forums. Joe was skeptical at first, but when he saw the customer numbers rise, he let out a big laugh and clapped me on the shoulder. Kid, you don't just know how to fix cars. You know how to make people notice. But no matter how hard I tried, the old wounds hadn't healed. Some nights, alone in my rented room, I thought about my family. I wondered if my parents ever thought of me, if they ever wondered how I was living. I heard Henry was now a vice president at Dillon Furniture Co., and Scott was about to graduate from Stanford with a slew of job offers from big companies. I didn't envy them, but I couldn't deny the pain of knowing I'd been erased from their story. I was no longer part of the Dillon family, at least not in their eyes. Once I ran into my mother at a supermarket. I was buying a few essentials while she pushed a cart full of groceries, still as elegant as ever. I froze, unsure whether to call out to her. But then she saw me, her eyes flickering with surprise before she quickly looked away as if I were a stranger. I stood there clutching my bag of groceries, feeling like I'd been stabbed. I wanted to run after her, to shout that I was doing well, that I was doing what I loved. But I just turned and walked out of the supermarket, the pain smoldering in my chest. Those years shaped me, not just in skill, but in spirit. I learned patience, how to get back up after every failure, and that my worth didn't lie in the Dillon name, but in what I could achieve. I was no longer the lonely boy sitting at the corner of the dining table. I was Austin, a mechanic, building my own path. But I didn't yet know that fate was preparing to hand me a bigger opportunity, one that would change everything. Joe's garage, though small, became my second home. I loved the early mornings when the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, illuminating the cars waiting to be fixed. I loved the clank of metal, the smell of engine oil, and even Joe's grumbling whenever a difficult customer complained about a bill. But what I loved most was the feeling when a car, thought to be dead, roared back to life under my hands. Each time I thought of my grandfather Victor, of the days in his shed when he taught me that every machine has its own story if only I listened. Joe wasn't just my boss, he was like a teacher, a second father. He wasn't as warm as my grandmother Dorothy, but he had his own way of caring. One evening, after an exhausting day of work, he called me over, handed me a cold beer and said, "Kid, you've got good hands. But more importantly, you've got a brain. Don't let it go to waste." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his eyes were serious, as if he saw something in me that I hadn't yet recognized. The big opportunity came on a winter day when Joe's garage hit hard times. The economy in Nashville was slowing, customers were dwindling, and bills piled up on Joe's desk. I saw him sitting in his small office, tapping a pen on the table, his face etched with worry. "If things keep going like this, I might have to close the garage," he said one evening, his voice heavy with sadness. "I'm getting old, Austin. I don't have the energy to keep this up." I couldn't let that happen. This garage wasn't just my workplace, it was where I found myself. I started thinking of ways to save it. During sleepless nights, I tinkered on my old laptop, researching how to promote a business. I didn't have a business degree like Henry or Scott, but I had persistence and a bit of creativity honed from years of manual labor. I proposed a plan to Joe: create a simple website for the garage, post on local community groups, and offer promotions like free first-time maintenance or discounted oil changes. I also suggested improving customer service, calling to remind clients of maintenance schedules, noting their preferences to create a personalized experience. Joe initially shook his head, saying, "That tech stuff isn't for mechanics," but when I kept pushing, he reluctantly agreed. "All right, kid," he said, "give it a shot. If it flops, don't blame me." I smiled, knowing this was my chance to prove I was more than just a mechanic. I worked day and night, fixing cars while handling the promotion efforts. I taught myself how to write ads, took photos of the cars we repaired to post online. I even stood outside the garage handing out flyers to passers-by, smiling despite the winter cold numbing my hands. Slowly, customers started coming back. An elderly woman came in to check her brakes, saying she saw our post online. A truck driver stopped by because a friend recommended our affordable maintenance package. Revenue crept up, not by much, but enough to keep Joe from talking about closing. Joe began looking at me differently. One evening after the garage had closed, he called me into his office. "Austin," he said, his voice low but warm, "you saved this garage. I don't know where you learned all this, but you've got talent. More than just a mechanic." I blushed, mumbling a thank you, but inside a fire blazed. For the first time, I felt truly recognized, not by my family, but by someone who understood my worth. As time passed, Joe trusted me more. He put me in charge of scheduling the mechanics, handling orders, and even dealing with difficult customers. I learned to stay calm when being yelled at, to negotiate with suppliers for better prices, and to delight customers with small gestures, like cleaning a car's interior before returning it. The garage became more than just a repair shop. It became a place that inspired trust. I was proud, but I knew I still had a long way to go. Then one day, Joe asked me to come to his house. I was nervous, thinking I'd done something wrong. But when I arrived, his wife Mary greeted me with a smile, and his daughter Megan was at the dining table looking at me with curiosity. Megan, a few years older than me, was a smart, independent woman working in interior design. We'd met a few times at the garage when she visited her father, but we'd never talked much. That evening, Joe looked at me, then at Megan, and said, "Austin, I've been thinking a lot. I don't have a son, but I see you as one. I want you to take over this garage when I retire." I was stunned, unable to believe my ears. "Joe, what do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He smiled, clapping me on the shoulder. "You've proven yourself. I believe you'll take this garage further than I ever could. Not right now, but keep working, keep learning, and when the time comes, it's yours." I glanced at Megan, expecting her to object, but she just smiled and nodded slightly. "I also want you and Megan to get to know each other," Joe added, making me blush. Megan laughed, but her eyes didn't seem to say no. From that day, I saw the garage in a new light. It wasn't just a workplace, it was my future. I worked harder, not just to prove myself to Joe, but to myself. Megan started coming to the garage more often, helping with ideas for designing the waiting area or suggesting ways to improve services. We grew closer, and I realized my heart, frozen from the days of being shunned by my family, was slowly thawing. Megan was unlike anyone I'd ever met. She was intelligent, sharp, but also gentle and sincere. In the afternoons after work, we'd often sit in the backyard of the garage, sipping coffee and talking about everything, from designing a new logo for the garage to our bigger dreams. She told me about her desire to design interiors for modest homes, places where people could feel warmth. I shared stories of my days at my grandparents' house, of how my grandfather Victor taught me to listen to an engine's hum. For the first time, I felt heard, understood. Not for who I was supposed to be, but for who I was. After a year, I mustered all my courage to propose. Under the sunset in the garage's backyard, I knelt down, my hands trembling as I held a simple ring I'd saved up for over the year. "Megan," I said, my voice choking, "you're the first person who's made me feel like I'm enough. I can't promise you the world, but I promise to give you my entire world to make you happy." She cried, nodded, and hugged me. In that moment, I knew I was no longer alone. Preparing for the wedding was a journey full of joy, but also laced with painful stabs. I wanted to invite my family, even though I knew the hope might be futile. I wrote handwritten letters to my parents, Henry and Scott, inviting them to my big day. In the letters, I briefly shared about my life, the garage, Megan, and said how much I wanted to see them. I didn't expect them to come, but a part of me, the little boy Austin from years ago, still longed for my family to see me, even just once. The wedding day arrived, a radiant spring morning in Nashville. The ceremony was simple, held at a small farm on the outskirts with rustic wooden tables and wildflowers decorating the space. Megan looked stunning in a simple white dress, her smile making my heart race. Joe, in a slightly tight suit, walked her down the aisle, his eyes red with emotion. My grandmother Dorothy sat in the front row, constantly wiping tears, while my grandfather Victor, though much weaker now, held my hand tightly and whispered, "You've done well, Austin." But as I scanned the crowd, my heart sank. No father, no mother, no Henry, no Scott. I had hoped, even just a little, that they would show up, but they weren't there. I tried to keep a smile on my face, tried not to let Megan or my grandparents see the pain tearing at my heart. I held Megan's hand, exchanged vows, and when she said, "I love you," in front of everyone, I felt healed. But deep inside, the old wound still bled. My family, the people I once called my flesh and blood, had chosen not to be there on the most important day of my life. I told myself I didn't need them, that I had Megan, my grandparents, and Joe. But the pain, no matter how hard I tried to bury it, still smoldered. That night after the wedding reception ended, Megan and I sat on the farm's porch looking at the twinkling stars in the sky. She held my hand, as if sensing the sadness I was trying to hide. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. I smiled, kissing her forehead. "I have you, and that's enough." But in my heart, I made a vow to myself. I would succeed, not just for myself, but so that one day my family would have to look at me differently. I would prove that Austin Dillon was not the spare son. The wedding was a turning point, marking a new beginning. Megan and I moved into a small apartment in Nashville, where she transformed every corner into a cozy home with her thoughtful design touches. I continued working at Joe's garage, but now I was more than just a mechanic. I started dreaming bigger. With Megan's support, I made plans to expand the garage, turning it into a place that didn't just fix cars, but offered a unique experience for customers. Over the next 6 months, I worked tirelessly. I convinced Joe to invest in a second location in a more populated area of Nashville. I applied everything I'd learned: online marketing, personalized customer service, and training new mechanics to maintain consistent quality. Megan helped design the new branch, creating a comfortable waiting area with free coffee and Wi-Fi. On the opening day of the second location, customers lined up and Joe hugged me, saying, "Kid, you're doing something big here." But that joy was quickly overshadowed by an irreparable loss. On the morning of the opening, as I was doing a final check before we opened the doors, my phone rang. It was my grandmother Dorothy, her voice choked with tears on the other end. "Austin, your grandfather. He's gone." I froze as if the world had stopped turning. My grandfather Victor, the man who had ignited my passion, who had believed in me when my entire family turned their backs, had passed away from a sudden heart attack. I drove like a madman to my grandparents' house, my heart in turmoil. When I stepped into the familiar wooden home, I saw my grandmother sitting in an armchair, her eyes red, clutching a framed photo of my grandfather. I knelt beside her, hugging her tightly, but I couldn't cry. The pain inside me was too vast, like a deep void swallowing every emotion. I looked at the shed where he used to teach me about cars, and it felt like a piece of my soul had been torn away. My grandfather's funeral took place a few days later in a small church on the outskirts of town. I stood there, holding my grandmother's hand, watching the stream of people who came to say goodbye. But as I looked around, my heart ached again. My parents were there, but they stood in a far corner, not saying a word to me. Henry and Scott were there too, but their gazes were cold, as if I were a stranger. In the midst of farewelling the person I loved most, my family still treated me as invisible. At one point, Scott passed by, looking me up and down before smirking. "Still fixing cars, Austin?" Grandpa must be so disappointed. I clenched my fists, wanting to scream in his face to tell him that Grandpa was prouder of me than anyone. But I stayed silent, letting the pain silently burn in my chest. Scott's mocking words weren't just a passing comment. They were like a fire, burning away the last shred of hope that my family would ever see me differently. But that pain became my fuel. Standing before my grandfather's grave, I vowed to myself that I would no longer let anyone define my worth. I would build something great, not to prove anything to them, but to live up to the faith my grandfather had in me, to honor Megan's love, and to be true to myself. Back at the garage, I threw myself into work like a soldier heading into battle. I began to dream bigger, not just a few small garages in Nashville, but a chain of auto services spanning across America. The idea sounded insane, even to me. I didn't have a prestigious degree like Henry or Scott, nor the vast capital of Dillon Furniture Co., but I had my hands, my mind, and an unshakable determination. I started with small steps. I spent nights researching the market, learning to analyze customer needs from online forums and local data. I improved our services, going beyond just fixing cars to create an experience. Clean waiting areas, friendly staff, and transparent maintenance packages. Megan, with her design talent, helped me craft a recognizable brand. Joe's Auto Repair became Dillon's Auto Care, with Dillon not as a boast of my family name, but as a reminder of my own journey. She suggested using blue and white colors to evoke trust, and I knew I'd made the right choice in having her by my side. In the first 3 years, I opened 7 more garages, expanding from Tennessee to neighboring states like Kentucky and Alabama. Each branch was a challenge. I had to find locations, negotiate leases, hire mechanics, and ensure consistent quality. Some days I slept only 3 hours, driving from one garage to another, fixing cars and checking the books. Megan was always there, helping with paperwork, designing spaces, and sometimes just holding my hand when I was exhausted. Joe, though retired, would drop by, looking at me with a mix of pride and concern. "Don't run too fast, kid," he said, "but I know you'll make it." By the 5th year, my chain had grown to 25 locations. I started implementing technology like customer management software and online booking systems, things rare for small garages. I hired a young team, people who shared my passion for cars, and trained them not just in technical skills but in customer care. I wanted every customer who walked into Dillon's Auto Care to feel like they were coming home. Revenue grew steadily, and I, once just a mechanic, had become an entrepreneur with millions in assets. But I never forgot the days of washing dishes, hauling crates, or sleeping in a moldy rented room. They reminded me that everything I had was earned through sweat and tears. Throughout that journey, my family never reached out. I quietly followed their lives through news articles and reports. Dillon Furniture Company was struggling. My father, with his rigid mindset, was slow to innovate, causing the company to lose its competitive edge. Henry, despite his talent, couldn't convince my father to change. Scott, with his arrogance, made mistakes in management, losing major contracts. I wasn't happy about their struggles, but I wasn't sad either. I just felt an emptiness where my love for my family once was. They were no longer part of my life, and I had learned to accept that. Megan and my father-in-law, Joe, were the only ones who stayed by my side. Megan was more than a wife. She was my partner, my confidant. She kept me grounded, reminded me to eat on time, and made me laugh when I was stressed. Joe, though he'd handed over the garage, remained the one I'd turn to for advice. "You're doing well, Austin," he said, "but don't forget to live for yourself, not just for work." Those words, along with Megan's love, were the fire that kept me going. Then one day, when my chain reached 50 locations, something unexpected happened. Forbes magazine contacted me, wanting to interview me about my journey from mechanic to self-made millionaire. They called me From Mechanic to Millionaire and put me on the cover. When I held the magazine, seeing myself standing in front of one of my garages, I couldn't believe it. I, Austin Dillon, the boy once called Spare, was now a symbol of perseverance. Megan hugged me, crying with pride. My grandmother Dorothy, though much weaker now, sent me a handwritten letter saying my grandfather would be smiling from above. But my family, my parents, Henry, Scott, offered not a single word of congratulations. I wasn't surprised, but I couldn't deny the pang in my heart. I had come a long way, from a lonely boy to a successful man, but they still didn't see me. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I had Megan, my grandmother Joe, and myself. But deep down, I knew I still longed for the day they would acknowledge me. Not for my wealth or fame, but for being Austin, the youngest son they had once overlooked. That 10-year journey wasn't just about building a garage empire. It was about finding myself, learning to stand tall despite being knocked down, and turning pain into motivation. I didn't know that. Just when I thought I had achieved everything, fate was preparing a new challenge, an invitation from the father who had turned his back on me, calling me back to the house where it all began. I received the call on a late afternoon while I was reviewing the books in the main office of Dylan's Auto Care. My phone buzzed, and when I saw my father's number, I nearly dropped the coffee mug in my hand. It had been nearly a decade since he last called, since our final conversation when he declared he'd cut off all support and told me not to disgrace the Dylan name. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, and answered. My father's voice, as stern as ever, came through the line. "Austin," he said, getting straight to the point, "this Thanksgiving, come home. There's something important." I was stunned, unsure how to respond. "What is it?" I asked, my voice dry. But he only replied, "Just come. The family is waiting." Then he hung up, leaving me with a flood of questions. Megan, sitting nearby, looked at me with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, but inside a storm of emotions raged. I didn't know what my father wanted, but a part of me, the young Austin from years ago, hoped they had seen what I'd accomplished. The Forbes article, 50 garage locations, the reputation of Dylan's Auto Care. Did they know? Would they finally see me differently? On Thanksgiving Day, I drove back to Nashville, Megan by my side, holding my hand to give me courage. The Dylan family mansion came into view, as grand as it was in my memories, with its oak-paneled walls and glowing chandeliers. But this time, I wasn't the lost boy walking in. I was Austin Dillon, the man who had built an empire from nothing. I squeezed Megan's hand, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. The dining table was set lavishly, as it always was for Thanksgiving in the past. My father sat at the head, my mother beside him, her eyes flickering with surprise when she saw me. Henry and Scott sat across, both impeccably dressed, but I noticed a weariness on their faces. The atmosphere in the room was tense, far from the warm family gatherings of my memories. I introduced Megan, and my mother offered a faint smile, saying a few polite words. Henry nodded while Scott merely glanced at me, his eyes carrying that familiar hint of disdain. The meal began in silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery on plates. I tried to make conversation, asking about the company, but my father answered curtly, and Henry and Scott barely responded. Then, as dessert was served, my father stood, raising his wine glass. "I have an important announcement," he said, his voice low but icy. The room fell silent. My heart pounded, hoping he might say something about me, about what I'd achieved. "My will has been finalized," my father continued, scanning the table. "All assets of Dillon Furniture Company. This house and everything belonging to the family will be divided equally between Henry and Scott." Then he looked straight at me, his eyes devoid of emotion. "Austin, you will receive nothing." The room seemed to stop breathing. Megan gripped my hand tightly under the table, but I didn't dare look at her. I felt as if I'd been stabbed, not because of the inheritance, which I didn't need, but because his words reaffirmed that I was nothing to my family. My mother lowered her head, saying nothing. Henry smirked, and Scott let out a scoff as if this was a given. I wanted to stand, to scream at them, to tell them I'd built an empire bigger than they could imagine. But I just smiled, nodded, and kept eating the pumpkin pie on my plate. I couldn't let them see my pain. Then, unexpectedly, a small voice broke the silence from the end of the table. It was Charlie, Henry's 9-year-old son. "Dad, who's this guy?" he asked, pointing at me. Henry hesitated, caught off guard, but before he could answer, Charlie continued, his voice brimming with excitement. "I saw him in Forbes magazine the other day. He's the car repair guy, right? He's super rich." The room fell deathly silent. My father froze, his wine glass halting midair. My mother stared at me, eyes wide, as if she couldn't believe her ears. Henry and Scott turned to Charlie, then to me, their gazes a mix of doubt and confusion. My heart raced, but I stayed silent. I looked at Charlie and smiled. "Thanks, Charlie," I said calmly. "I just do what I love." No one said another word. The meal ended in awkward silence. Megan and I left shortly after without looking back. In the car, Megan hugged me, but I didn't cry. The pain was still there, but it no longer had the power to break me. I had come too far to care about their disdain. But I didn't know that Charlie's mention of Forbes was a seed, a small spark that would change everything in the days to come. Back home, I sat alone in the living room holding the Forbes magazine with my picture on the cover. I looked into my own eyes in the photo and saw a man who was no longer the lonely boy of years past. I had proven my worth, not to my parents or brothers, but to myself. But deep down, I knew my story with my family wasn't over. And as I suspected, a few days later, another call from my father opened a new chapter, one I never could have anticipated. The phone rang early one morning while I was in the main office of Dylan's Auto Care, reviewing plans for a new branch in Texas. My father's number flashed on the screen, sending a jolt down my spine. I answered cautiously. "Dad?" "Austin?" My father's voice was as stern as ever, but this time there was something different, as if he was holding something back. "This afternoon, come to the company. The board of directors wants to meet you. It's important." He didn't elaborate, hanging up as abruptly as before. I sat there, still clutching the phone, my mind reeling. The board of directors of Dillon Furniture Company? Meeting me? For what? Part of me suspected it was a prank, or worse, another reprimand. But another part, the part still yearning for recognition, urged me to go. Megan looked at me, worried but asking little. She just held my hand and said, "Whatever happens, you're still my Austin." Her words were like a cool breeze, soothing the storm in my heart. I put on a simple suit, not the expensive kind Henry or Scott would wear, but one I'd bought for meetings with business partners. Then I drove to the headquarters of Dillon Furniture Co., the place I used to trail behind my father as a child, where I once felt small and invisible. The company headquarters was as grand as I remembered, with gleaming glass walls and the Dillon Furniture Company logo embossed at the entrance. But as I stepped into the boardroom, I sensed a different atmosphere. The board of directors, men and women in sharp suits, sat around a long oak table. My father was at the head, my mother beside him, her eyes flickering with unease when she saw me. Henry and Scott were there too, but they wouldn't meet my gaze, their eyes fixed on the table as if hiding something. I stood tall, trying to stay calm despite my pounding heart. My father stood, clearing his throat. "Austin?" he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. I was wrong. The room seemed to hold its breath. I was stunned, unable to believe my ears. My father, who never apologized to anyone, was saying, "What?" He continued, looking directly at me for the first time without disdain. "I underestimated you, didn't see your worth. But what you've done, Dillon's Auto Care, the Forbes article, you've proven you're a Dillon in your own way." My throat tightened. Henry and Scott looked up, their eyes a mix of surprise and irritation. The board members watched me, some nodding, others whispering among themselves. My father went on, his voice lower. "The company is struggling. We've been slow to innovate, lost contracts, and our competitors are outpacing us. We need you, Austin. We need what you've done with your garage chain. Can you help Dillon Furniture Co. recover?" My head spun. This was the moment I'd dreamed of, my family acknowledging me. But it also hurt. My father's words, even as an apology, reminded me of the years I was overlooked and mocked. I glanced at Henry, saw him clench his fists. Scott smirked, as if he couldn't believe my father was turning to me. My mother lowered her head, but I noticed her eyes were red. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "I'm honored," I said, looking straight at my father. "But I have a condition. If I help the company double its growth in 2 years, I want 10% of Dillon Furniture Co.'s shares." The room went silent again. I knew the request was bold, almost audacious. But I was no longer the scared boy from years ago. I was Austin Dillon, who had built an empire from nothing. And I knew my worth. My father frowned, glancing at the board members. Henry shot up, his voice sharp. 10%? Is he joking? He's just a mechanic. Scott scoffed, but my father raised a hand for silence. The board members whispered among themselves. Then an older woman, the chairwoman, spoke. "We need innovation, Albert. If Austin can deliver what he claims, 10% is a fair price." After heated debate, my father looked at me and nodded. Fine, 2 years, double the growth. If you do it, 10% is yours. I nodded, saying nothing more. Inside, I was a tangle of emotions, moved by finally being recognized, but pained by the old wounds that hadn't healed. I knew this wasn't just a chance to save the company, but a chance to confront my family and myself. As I left the boardroom, I felt Henry and Scott's eyes boring into me, but I didn't look back. I was ready. The next day, I got to work. I spent weeks studying Dillon Furniture Co., from its production processes to its marketing strategies. I identified issues Henry and Scott had missed or ignored: outdated processes, a weak online presence, and poor customer service. I proposed bold changes: digital marketing, AI to optimize the supply chain, and improved customer experiences. At first, Henry fiercely opposed me, calling my ideas far-fetched. Scott mocked me, saying, "Don't bring your car repair tricks here." But my father, for the first time, sided with me. "Let Austin try," he said firmly. I worked day and night, not just for the 10% stake, but to prove I could do it. Megan supported me with new design ideas for products, helping Dillon Furniture Co. to create modern furniture lines that matched market trends. I hired a young team, as I had with my garages, and trained them to think and work differently. Slowly, the company began to change. Revenue grew, customers returned, and the name Dillon Furniture Co. reappeared in the press, not for failure, but for its revival. But I didn't let success make me arrogant. Every night coming home to Megan, I still felt the old wounds, the pain of being dismissed for years. I knew this journey wasn't just about saving the company, it was about saving myself, the boy who once sat alone at the corner of the dining table. And I knew the road ahead was still long, with challenges I couldn't yet foresee. I dove into transforming Dillon Furniture Co. with the same passion, perseverance, and audacity I had poured into building Dillon's Auto Care. I was no longer just a mechanic, but a strategist, someone who dared to think differently. I applied what I'd learned from my garage chain: digital marketing to reach younger customers, AI to streamline production, and personalized customer service to create a sense of connection. I launched bold campaigns like live streaming the furniture-making process on social media and partnering with young designers to release modern, affordable product lines. Megan played a huge role, designing collections that breathed new life into the brand, making customers buy not just the product but the story behind it. But not everything went smoothly. Henry, as vice president, constantly opposed me, claiming I was destroying the company's traditions. Scott mocked me, calling me the mechanic who thinks he knows business. I didn't argue back. I let the results speak. In the first 6 months, revenue grew by 30%, and major contracts started returning. The board members, initially skeptical, began looking at me with respect. My father, though still stern, started calling me into his office to discuss strategy, something he had never done before. By the 18th month, Dillon Furniture Co. not only met the goal of doubling growth but exceeded expectations. Revenue tripled, market share expanded, and the Dillon name became a symbol of innovation once again. Forbes contacted me a second time, wanting to interview me about the journey of the forgotten youngest son who saved the family empire. I agreed, but this time I requested the interview take place at Dillon Furniture Co.'s headquarters with my family present. On the day of the interview, I stood in the boardroom facing the cameras, my gaze confident but not arrogant. My father, mother, Henry, and Scott sat in the back row alongside the board members. The journalist asked about my journey from mechanic to shareholder of Dillon Furniture Company. I shared it all, holding nothing back: the struggles, the sleepless nights, the times my family dismissed me. But I emphasized that everything I did was driven by belief in myself, Megan's love, and my grandfather Victor's lesson. Listen to the machine, Austin. It will show you the way. When the interview ended, my father stood and walked toward me. The room fell silent. He looked at me, his eyes no longer cold or distant. "Austin," he said, his voice low but sincere, "I'm sorry. I was wrong not to see you. I'm proud of you." It was the first time in my life I heard him say those words. My mother stepped forward, hugging me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My son, I was wrong," she whispered. "I'm sorry for not being there for you." Henry and Scott stood in the background, their expressions complex, a mix of envy and reluctant admiration. Henry stepped forward, shaking my hand, his voice stiff but no longer hostile. "You did well, Austin," he said. Scott just nodded, saying nothing, but I knew he saw me differently now. I didn't need their love or for them to make up for the lost years. I just needed them to see me, and this time they did. The board officially granted me the 10% stake, as agreed. But to me, the real value wasn't in the shares. It was in the journey I'd taken. I had proven I wasn't the spare brother. I was Austin Dillon, who had turned pain into motivation and loneliness into strength. But the wounds of my childhood, the days of being overlooked, lingered like a smoldering fire. I forgave my family, but I didn't forget. I chose to move forward, carrying those scars as part of who I am. That evening, Megan and I sat in our backyard, gazing at the starry sky. She rested her head on my shoulder and asked, "How do you feel now that they've finally acknowledged you?" I smiled, holding her hand. "I feel relieved," I said. "But what matters most is that I always believed in myself. And I have you." I looked up at the stars, thinking of my grandfather Victor, who had given me passion and faith. I thought of my 10-year journey, from a moldy rented room to the cover of Forbes, from a lonely boy to a respected man. And I thought of the lesson I wanted to leave for anyone who ever felt invisible, as I once did. Don't let others define your worth. Listen to your heart, find your own path, and follow it to the end. Even if you're overlooked or underestimated, you can still become the best version of yourself. My story isn't over. Dillon's Auto Care is still expanding, and Dillon Furniture Co. is on a growth trajectory. But I know there are more challenges ahead. There will be days when I face doubt, scornful glances, or even the sting of old wounds. But I'm ready. I'm no longer the boy sitting alone at the corner of the dining table waiting for a glance. I'm Austin Dillon, and I will keep writing my story, with the belief that every machine and every person has a story worth hearing.